Before the very first sunrise, when time itself was just a thought, there was only a profound and endless silence. Imagine it. No heartbeat, no breath, not a single sound except the quiet whisper of eternity stretching into infinity. And then, breaking through that immense quiet, the voice of God thundered like a storm gathering across a formless void. Let there be light. In that single powerful moment, the universe ignited. Galaxies swirled into existence like paint on a cosmic canvas. Stars were born, fiery and brilliant, scattering diamonds across the velvet blackness. Worlds took shape, and on a small blue sphere, newly formed oceans learned to sing their ancient rhythmic song against the shores. The mountains rose, scraping the heavens, and the dust of the earth, rich and fertile, lay waiting. It was waiting for purpose, for a story to be written upon it. From that very dust, the Lord God reached down. With the care of a master sculptor, he shaped man. It wasn't just a form, it was a masterpiece, crafted in his own image. And then, in the most intimate act of creation, God leaned in and breathed into this form the breath of life. Suddenly there was a heartbeat. There was breath. Man became a living soul. A garden was planted for him, a paradise named Eden. It bloomed in a riot of color and fragrance, perfect and untouched by any blemish. The rivers flowed with crystal-clear water, and the trees were heavy with every kind of delicious fruit. In this idyllic world there was no pain, no sickness, no tears, no death. There was no fear, only a perfect, unbroken peace between heaven and earth. Adam walked with God in the cool of the day, their communion as natural as the setting sun. Life was an eternal present, a continuous joy. The animals lived in harmony, and the man, given dominion over all of it, was its gentle steward. He was given everything his heart could desire, a world of wonders to explore and a direct connection to his Creator. There was just one rule, one single boundary in this limitless paradise, a tree that stood in the middle of the garden, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. You may eat from any tree, God had said, but from this one you shall not eat. For on the day you eat of it you will surely die. It was a simple command, a test of trust and obedience in a world that knew nothing of deceit. But a shadow was creeping at the edges of this perfect world, a subtle question planted like a seed of doubt. The serpent, the most cunning of all the creatures, approached Eve. He didn't come with threats or force, but with a whisper, a question designed to unravel everything. Did God really say you must not eat from any tree in the garden? It was a small twist of the truth, but it was enough. Eve corrected him, but the seed was sown. The serpent then made a promise that directly contradicted God's warning. You will not surely die, he hissed, for God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. The temptation was powerful, to possess a knowledge reserved for God, to step beyond the boundary of humanity and grasp at divinity. She looked at the fruit. It was beautiful, pleasing to the eye, and the serpent's promise made it seem desirable for gaining wisdom. In that one moment, trust in God's goodness wavered. She took the fruit. She ate. And then she gave some to her husband, Adam, who was with her, and he ate too. It wasn't a grand rebellion, but a quiet, conscious choice. One bite, one moment of disobedience that would echo through all of history. And in that instant, everything changed. Their eyes were opened, just as the serpent had promised. But what they saw wasn't godhood. They saw their own nakedness, their vulnerability. For the first time, they felt shame. Fear, an emotion that had no place in Eden, flooded their hearts. They frantically stitched fig leaves together to cover themselves, a futile attempt to hide from their new reality and from the one who had given them everything. When they heard the sound of the Lord God walking in the garden in the cool of the day, they didn't run to greet him as they once had. They hid. They hid among the trees, their hearts pounding with a new and terrible dread. God called out, "Where are you?" It wasn't a question of location. God knew where they were. It was a question of relationship, a heartbroken plea from a father whose children had turned away. The excuses began. Adam blamed Eve. Eve blamed the serpent. No one took responsibility. The perfect communion was shattered, replaced by blame, fear, and separation. And with that break came the consequences. The ground was cursed. Work would become toil and sweat. Childbirth would be filled with pain, and the serpent was cursed to crawl on its belly, forever an enemy of humanity. But the most devastating consequence was the fulfillment of God's original warning. They would now experience death. Their bodies, once meant for eternity, would now grow old, decay, and return to the dust from which they were made. They were banished from the Garden of Eden, and an angel with a flaming sword was placed to guard the way back to the tree of life. Humanity had lost immortality. The gate to paradise was closed. Man had become mortal. He was now subject to suffering, to struggle, and to the finality of death. This is the story of how humanity fell, how we traded perfect peace for the chaotic knowledge of good and evil. It's a story of profound loss, a tragedy that has defined the human condition ever since. But even in this darkest moment, in the shadow of the fall, a glimmer of light appeared. As God pronounced the curse upon the serpent, he made a promise. He spoke of a future offspring of the woman who would crush the serpent's head. It was the very first whisper of a rescue plan, a promise of a Redeemer who would one day confront the evil that had entered the world and conquer it. This is not just the story of how man became mortal. It is also the story of how hope was born in the exact moment it seemed all hope was lost. It's the beginning of a much larger narrative, a divine rescue mission to reclaim what was lost in the garden. The journey from that point forward is humanity's journey, a search for redemption, a longing for a paradise lost, and the unfolding story of God's unwavering love for a world that had turned its back on him. When Adam and Eve stepped out of the Garden of Eden, they weren't just leaving a place, they were leaving behind a world of perfect harmony. Imagine taking that first step, the gate closing behind you, and feeling the world shift under your feet. The ground, once a willing partner in creation, now resisted. Thorns and thistles sprang up where fruit once grew freely. The air, once filled with the gentle presence of God, now felt colder, emptier. The silence was no longer peaceful. It was heavy with loss, with what-ifs, and with the stark reality of their new existence. They were exiles in a world they were meant to rule. Every sunrise brought not just light, but the challenge of survival. Every sunset was a reminder of the paradise they had forfeited. Yet even in this harsh new reality, God's mercy was a quiet, persistent thread. It wasn't a grand, sweeping gesture that erased their mistake, but a series of small, significant graces woven into the fabric of their difficult lives. One of the first and most profound of these graces was the birth of their children. Eve, who had been promised pain in childbirth, experienced that prophecy coming true. The agony was real, a physical manifestation of their spiritual fall. But through that pain came a sound never before heard outside of paradise, the cry of a newborn baby. In that cry was not just suffering, but a powerful, defiant spark of life. Each child was a testament to the future, a living, breathing promise that humanity would continue. They were the first generation born into a broken world, yet they carried within them the potential for redemption, a flicker of the hope that was whispered back in the garden, the promise of a future savior. Adam, for his part, embraced his new role with a heavy heart, but a determined spirit. He worked the soil, his sweat falling like tears, like prayers, upon the stubborn earth. The ground fought him at every turn. It demanded his strength, his patience, his unwavering effort. Farming wasn't just a task, it was a daily battle. But in that struggle, Adam learned something profound about endurance. He learned resilience. Each harvest, no matter how small, was a victory. It was a hard-won triumph that fed his family and taught his children the value of perseverance. He was no longer just a caretaker of a perfect garden. He was a pioneer, carving out a life from the raw, untamed wilderness. He learned to read the seasons, to understand the rhythms of the earth, and to depend on God not for effortless provision, but for the strength to provide for himself. Their sons, Cain and Abel, grew up in this world of toil and hope. They were the first brothers, the first to learn from their parents' stories of a paradise they had never seen. They learned about God, about sacrifice, and about worship. One day they both brought offerings to the Lord. Abel, a shepherd, brought the best of his flock, a fat, healthy lamb. He offered it with a heart full of faith, humility, and a genuine desire to honor God. His offering was an acknowledgement of his dependence on his Creator. Cain, a farmer, brought some of the fruit of the ground. But the Bible tells us his heart was not in the right place. Perhaps his offering was given out of obligation, a mere formality. Perhaps it was tainted with pride, a sense that his own hard work was what truly mattered. Whatever the reason, God looked upon Abel's offering with favor, but he did not accept Cain's. This divine rejection wasn't a condemnation without warning. God spoke to Cain, gently questioning him, "Why are you angry? If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must rule over it." This was a moment of profound choice for Cain. God was giving him a chance to examine his heart, to repent, to overcome the darkness brewing within him. But Cain refused. He let the poison of jealousy and resentment take root. He saw his brother not as a brother, but as a rival, the source of his shame and anger. The warning went unheeded. The beast of sin was no longer crouching at the door. Cain had invited it in. And so the unthinkable happened. Out in the field, where they should have been working side by side, Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. It was the first murder, the first time a human life was violently taken by another. The blood of Abel cried out from the ground, a silent, horrifying scream that echoed through creation. The world, already fractured by disobedience, was now stained with fratricide. The first death among humanity was not from old age or accident, but from the bitter fruit of envy. Sorrow became a permanent shadow over the human heart. Adam and Eve, who had already lost paradise, now lost a son to death and another to sin. The ripple effects of that single act of disobedience in the garden had become a tidal wave of violence and grief. The world learned, in the most brutal way possible, the true nature of sin. It wasn't just a mistake or a poor choice. It was a destructive force that tears families apart and breaks the heart of God. Yet even in this moment of horrific darkness, God's mercy appeared in a way that is almost difficult to comprehend. When God confronted Cain, Cain's response was defiant. "Am I my brother's keeper?" But God's judgment, while severe, was not purely punitive. Cain was cursed to be a restless wanderer on the earth, the ground no longer yielding its strength to him. But when Cain cried out that his punishment was more than he could bear, that anyone who found him would kill him, God did something extraordinary. He placed a mark on Cain. This mark was not a brand of shame, but a sign of divine protection. It was God's declaration that vengeance belonged to him alone. It was an act of mercy in the midst of judgment, a strange and powerful grace extended to the first murderer. God did not abandon Cain. He preserved his life, even as Cain was forced to live with the consequences of his actions. After the tragedy of Cain and Abel, Adam and Eve had another son, and they named him Seth. Eve said, "God has granted me another child in place of Abel, since Cain killed him." Seth's birth represented a new beginning, a continuation of the line of faith. From Seth, generations began to pass. Humanity multiplied, spreading across the face of the earth. They built cities, developed crafts, created music, and forged tools from bronze and iron. On the surface, it looked like progress. Civilization was advancing. But beneath this veneer of development, the spiritual decay that began with Cain was spreading like a cancer. The wickedness of man grew great in the earth. The Bible paints a grim picture. Every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. The violence that started with a single murder had now infected entire societies. Corruption, greed, and selfishness became the ruling principles. The world was filled with injustice and cruelty. This wasn't what God had intended. His heart was filled with pain. He grieved that he had even made man on the earth. The beautiful world he had spoken into existence, the creation he had called very good, was now drowning in its own depravity. The experiment of humanity seemed to be a catastrophic failure. The situation was so dire that it called for a drastic cleansing response. The world had become so polluted by sin that it needed to be washed clean. But even then, in the face of near-universal rebellion, God did not completely give up on his creation. The Bible says, "But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord." In a world consumed by darkness, one man and his family still walked with God. One man still listened. One man still obeyed. And through this one man, Noah, God would provide a path for salvation. On Noah to build an ark, a vessel of rescue to preserve a remnant of life through the great storm that was coming, a storm that would judge the wicked and ultimately wash the world clean, offering humanity a second chance, a new beginning on the other side of the flood. We all know about Noah building the ark, but the real story, the story of humanity's second chance, begins when the rain finally stopped. Picture this. After Noah and his family spent months sealed inside the massive wooden ark, the sky, once a relentless torrent of grey, finally cleared. The world was utterly silent. For 40 days and 40 nights, rain had fallen without mercy. The great fountains of the deep had burst forth, and the floodwaters had risen to swallow even the highest mountains. Every living thing on the face of the earth, outside the safety of the ark, had been washed away. The planet was cleansed, returned to a primordial state of water and sky. Inside the ark, it was a world unto itself. Noah, his wife, his 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and their wives, were the sole keepers of humanity's future. Alongside them were the pairs of every kind of animal, a living library of God's creation. Imagine the sounds, the smells, the constant motion as the ark drifted on an endless ocean. It was a cradle of survival, rocking on the waves of a drowned world, a testament to faith in the face of absolute destruction. Then one day the rocking softened. The incessant drumming of rain on the roof ceased. After 150 days the waters began to recede. Slowly, miraculously, the peaks of mountains started to reappear like ancient islands emerging from the sea. The ark, which had been aimlessly adrift, finally came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. The journey on the water was over, but the weight was not. The world outside was still a vast, muddy expanse. Noah needed a sign. He needed to know if it was safe. So he opened a window in the ark and sent out a raven. The raven, a strong and resilient bird, flew back and forth, finding places to rest on the emerging land, but not returning to the ark. It was a sign that the waters were indeed receding. Still Noah waited. 7 days later, he sent out a different messenger, a dove. Doves are birds of peace, symbols of hope. The first time the dove returned quickly, finding no place to rest its feet. The earth was not yet ready. Noah took the dove back into the safety of the ark and waited another 7 days. This act of patience is so powerful, isn't it? He didn't rush. He trusted in the timing. He sent the dove out a second time. That evening, the dove returned. And this time, clutched in its beak, was a freshly plucked olive leaf. An olive leaf? Can you imagine the sheer joy and relief that must have flooded Noah's heart? This wasn't just a leaf. It was a message. It was a sign of life, a promise that the earth was healing, that plants were growing again. It was the ultimate symbol of peace and new beginnings. Noah waited 1 more week and sent the dove out a third and final time. This time, the dove did not return. It had found a home. The world was ready. The water had fully dried up from the land. The time had come. Following God's command, Noah opened the great door of the ark. Think about that moment, the first breath of fresh, clean air, the first ray of sunlight on their faces after so long. One by one, family and animals stepped out onto solid ground. The world smelled new, washed clean, quiet and waiting. The creatures, once confined, were now free to roam and fill the earth once more. It was a rebirth of the entire planet. What is the very first thing Noah did in this new world? He didn't rush to build a house or plant a field. He built an altar. His first act was one of worship and gratitude. He offered thanks to the Lord who had preserved them, who had seen them through the cataclysm. It was a profound act of acknowledging the source of his salvation. And in response to this heartfelt worship, God made a covenant, a solemn promise not just to Noah, but to all of humanity and every living creature for all generations to come. He said, "I establish my covenant with you. Never again will all life be destroyed by the waters of a flood. Never again will there be a flood to destroy the earth." And to seal this promise, he placed a sign in the clouds, a rainbow. The first rainbow. It wasn't just a beautiful atmospheric phenomenon. It was a divine weapon of war, a bow now hung in the sky, pointed away from the earth. It was God's promise to lay down his bow of judgment and instead extend his grace. Every time we see a rainbow, we are looking at a reminder of that ancient promise, a promise of mercy that endures to this day. This was the dawn of a new age, an era born from judgment but forever bound by grace. From Noah's 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, the entire world would be repopulated. Nations would rise and cultures would develop. They were given the same command as Adam and Eve: be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. Humanity had its second chance. But here the story takes a familiar, tragic turn. The memory of the flood and the grace that followed began to fade. The human heart, prone to pride and rebellion, began to stray once more. Generations passed, and the people, now speaking one language, migrated eastward. They settled in a plain in the land of Shinar, which we know today as ancient Mesopotamia, and there a new ambition took root. They said to each other, "Come, let us make bricks and bake them thoroughly." They had new technology, new skills, but what they chose to do with it reveals the growing pride in their hearts. "Come," they said, "let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves. Otherwise we will be scattered over the face of the whole earth." This wasn't about worship. This was about ambition. This was the Tower of Babel. They wanted to reach the heavens on their own terms, to make a name for themselves, not for God. They wanted to consolidate their power and defy God's command to fill the earth. It was a monument to human unity, yes, but a unity based on arrogance and self-reliance. They sought security in their own strength, in a tower of brick and mortar, rather than in the God who had promised to preserve them. The story of the ark, the flood, and the rainbow is a powerful lesson in judgment, grace, and the unwavering promise of God. But the story of the tower that followed is an equally powerful warning about human nature. It shows how quickly we can forget God's mercy and turn back to our own pride, seeking to build our own kingdoms and make our own names great. It's a cycle we see repeated throughout history and even in our own lives. The question it leaves for us is this: are we building our lives on a foundation of gratitude and faith, like Noah's altar? Or are we trying to build our own towers to the sky, relying on our own strength and ambition? It's a question worth thinking about. In this early world, there was a unique and powerful unity. From the oldest elder to the youngest child, everyone spoke the same language. Every thought, every idea, every plan could be shared and understood instantly. This wasn't just about easy communication. It was a bond that connected all people, giving their collective efforts immense power. As these people migrated, they found a wide, fertile plain in a land called Shinar, which we know today as part of ancient Mesopotamia. It was a perfect place to settle, to build, and to dream. And dream they did. But their dreams weren't just of homes and farms. A new, grand idea began to take hold. Someone, perhaps a charismatic leader, stood up and said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth." This idea resonated deeply. They had learned the art of making bricks, baking them hard in fire, and using bitumen for mortar. They had the technology, the manpower, and most importantly, the shared language to coordinate this massive undertaking. The project began with incredible energy. The sound of work filled the plains of Shinar as a city rose from the dust. And at its heart, the foundation of a magnificent tower was laid. Brick by brick, layer by layer, the tower grew. It was an architectural marvel, a testament to human ingenuity and cooperation. As it climbed higher, piercing the clouds, the people looked upon their creation with immense satisfaction. But with each new level, something else was growing alongside the structure. their pride. Their motivation wasn't to create something beautiful for their Creator or to build a monument of gratitude for being saved from the flood. The text is clear: they wanted to make a name for themselves. This was a project born from human ego. The tower was a symbol of their own strength, their own glory. They believed that through their own efforts they could reach the heavens, the domain of God. It was a defiant act of self-reliance, a statement that they didn't need God. They could achieve greatness and security on their own terms. Their fear wasn't of offending God, but of being scattered and losing their unified power. They wanted to create a central point of human power that would hold them all together, under their own authority. From his heavenly throne the Lord looked down. He saw the city and the tower that the children of man were building. He saw not just the bricks and mortar, but the hearts behind the work. He saw a rebellion brewing, not a rebellion of swords and shields, but a rebellion of the Spirit. It was a rejection of his sovereignty, a forgetting of the one who gave them life, breath, and the very skills they were using to defy him. God saw their unity, which he had given them, being twisted into a tool for arrogance. He said, "Behold, they are one people, and they have all one language, and this is only the beginning of what they will do. And now nothing that they propose to do will be impossible for them." This wasn't a statement of fear, but of concern. God knew that unchecked human ambition, fueled by pride and a unified ability to execute any plan, would lead only to further corruption and self-destruction. Humanity was on a dangerous path, believing themselves to be gods. So a divine decision was made, not to destroy them as in the flood, but to curb their pride in a way that was both merciful and profound. The Lord said, "Come, let us go down and there confuse their language, so that they may not understand one another's speech." It happened in an instant. One moment a worker called for more bricks and the man next to him heard only gibberish. A foreman shouted instructions, but his words were a meaningless jumble to his crew. Imagine the chaos. Frustration turned to anger. Cooperation shattered into confusion. The symphony of construction became a cacophony of discord. People who had been friends and collaborators now looked at each other as strangers. They couldn't communicate, they couldn't plan, they couldn't work together. The grand project ground to a halt. The people began to splinter, gathering with the few others who suddenly spoke the same new tongue they did. The unified family of humanity was broken into countless linguistic groups. With communication gone, the community dissolved. They abandoned their half-finished city and their proud tower. From that place, the Lord scattered them over the face of all the earth. The unfinished tower stood as a silent, stark monument. It was a relic of what could have been, but more importantly, a reminder of human pride and its limits. The city was given a name that would forever capture the essence of that day: Babel. The name itself is related to a Hebrew word meaning to confuse or to mix. It was the city of confusion, the birthplace of our world's linguistic diversity. From this event, nations were born. Tribes and clans traveled to distant lands, carrying with them their new languages and cultures. The world was filled with a beautiful and complex tapestry of different peoples, voices, and traditions. This scattering was a divine intervention, a reset button pressed to prevent humanity from self-destructing in its arrogance. It forced humanity to start over in smaller, more manageable groups. But here is the most beautiful part of the story. God's plan didn't end with scattering and division. This act of judgment was also an act of mercy, paving the way for a new kind of plan for redemption. The story of Babel sets the stage for what comes next in the biblical narrative. Out of one of these scattered nations, from the city of Ur, God would call one man. His name was Abram, later to be known as Abraham. He was a wanderer from a family of idol worshippers, but God chose him. He called Abram to leave his home and his people and journey to a new land. God made a promise to him: "I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." Do you see the incredible reversal? At Babel, humanity tried to make a name for themselves and was scattered. Now God promises to make Abram's name great and through him to bless all the scattered families of the earth. The division at Babel was not the end of the story. It was the necessary precursor to God's ultimate plan of reunification. Centuries later, this promise finds its ultimate fulfillment. After Jesus' resurrection, on the day of Pentecost, the disciples were gathered in one place. The Holy Spirit descended upon them, and something miraculous happened. They began to speak in other tongues, and the diverse crowd that had gathered in Jerusalem, people from every nation, each heard the disciples speaking in their own native language. Pentecost is the divine reversal of Babel. Where language was once confused to scatter humanity in judgment, language was now miraculously bridged to gather humanity in salvation. It was the beginning of the church, a new kind of community where Jew and Gentile, from every tribe and tongue, could be unified not by a tower of brick, but by faith in Jesus Christ. The pride that built Babel is replaced by the humility and grace found at the foot of the cross. The story of the Tower of Babel is more than just an ancient myth about why we speak different languages. It's a profound lesson about the human condition. It teaches us about the dangers of pride, the limits of our own strength, and our deep-seated desire for significance. It reminds us that true unity and lasting purpose are not found in building monuments to ourselves, but in humbly aligning ourselves with God's purposes. Today, we still build our own towers of Babel, in our careers, our ambitions, our pursuit of fame or wealth, trying to make a name for ourselves. But the story reminds us that this path ultimately leads to confusion and scattering. True fulfillment comes when we stop trying to reach heaven on our own terms and instead accept the grace that reaches down to us. When God called Abram, he didn't hesitate. He packed up his life, leaving behind the comfort and security of his homeland, Ur of the Chaldees. He wasn't a young man looking for adventure. He was established, wealthy, and yet he chose to obey a voice he had only just come to know. His compass was not a map, but a promise. I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. So Abram, his wife Sarai, and his nephew Lot began their journey. They traveled through deserts and foreign lands, not knowing their final destination. Their path was guided not by sight, but by sheer faith. Think about that for a moment. In a world that tells us to trust what we can see and touch, Abram staked his entire existence on the unseen. Along the way, wherever he stopped, he built altars. These weren't just piles of stone, they were declarations. They were monuments of worship to the God who had spoken to him, marking the land with his faith and gratitude. He was a pioneer, not just of a new land, but of a new way of relating to God. But faith is rarely a straight line. Years turned into a decade, then two. The promised son, the heir through whom this great nation would be born, was nowhere to be seen. Abram grew old. Sarai's hair, once dark, turned to silver. The laughter in their tent grew quieter, and the hope they held so dearly began to feel like a distant dream. Doubt, that subtle serpent, surely whispered in their ears. Did he hear God correctly? Was it all a mistake? Imagine the quiet conversations, the unspoken fears, the ache of an empty cradle. It's in these moments of profound doubt that God often speaks the loudest. Just when Abram's hope was at its lowest ebb, God appeared to him again. "Fear not, Abram," he said. "I am your shield, your very great reward." God didn't just offer words of comfort. He gave Abram a vision. He led the old man out of his tent and into the cool desert night. "Look up at the heavens," God commanded, "and count the stars, if you are able to count them." Imagine Abram, his neck craned, his eyes wide, trying to comprehend the sheer, uncountable multitude of stars glittering in the vast, dark expanse. Then came the promise that would echo through eternity. "So shall your descendants be." In that moment, something shifted. The Bible tells us that Abram believed the Lord, and it was credited to him as righteousness. He, a childless old man, looked at the stars and chose to believe in the impossible. He trusted the promise-maker more than his own circumstances. This act of belief was so profound that God solidified his covenant with Abram. He changed his name from Abram, meaning exalted father, to Abraham, which means father of many nations. And Sarai, his barren wife, was no longer Sarai, but Sarah, mother of nations. Their very identities were rewritten, not based on their present reality, but on the future God had sworn to them. It was a declaration that what God says is more real than what we see. And then the impossible happened. When Abraham was 100 years old and Sarah was 90, the promise took on flesh and blood. Laughter, long absent from their home, returned in the form of a baby's cry. They named him Isaac, which literally means, "he laughs," a beautiful reminder of their initial disbelief and God's ultimate faithfulness. The promise was alive, breathing, held in the arms of an elderly couple who had dared to believe. Isaac was more than just a son. He was a miracle, a testament to a God who keeps his word no matter how long the wait. But the journey of faith was not over. The greatest test was yet to come. Just when Abraham's heart was full, when his life seemed complete with the son he had waited a lifetime for, God spoke again. And this time, the command was heart-stopping. "Abraham," God said, "take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you." Can you even begin to imagine the weight of those words? The son of promise, the miracle child, the future of all nations, was to be sacrificed. Every fiber of Abraham's being must have screamed in protest. This command seemed to contradict everything God had promised. It was a test that went beyond logic, beyond reason, to the very core of his trust. Yet early the next morning Abraham rose, saddled his donkey, and began the 3-day journey to Mount Moriah, his beloved son walking by his side. What did they talk about? What thoughts tormented Abraham's mind as he walked toward the place of sacrifice? His heart was surely breaking, yet his trust in God, forged through decades of walking with him, did not shatter. He believed that the God who could bring a child from a dead womb could also raise a child from the dead. On the mountain, Isaac, in his innocence, asked, "Father, the fire and wood are here, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham's reply is one of the most profound statements of faith in all of Scripture. God himself will provide the lamb. He built the altar, arranged the wood, bound his precious son, and laid him on the altar. He raised the knife, his hand trembling, his resolve firm. In that terrible silent moment, heaven and earth held their breath. And then a voice cried out from heaven, "Abraham, Abraham, do not lay a hand on the boy. Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son." Abraham lowered the knife, his body likely collapsing in relief. And as he looked up, he saw a ram caught by its horns in a thicket. God had indeed provided the sacrifice. Abraham called that place Yahweh Yireh, which means the Lord will provide. On that mountain, his faith was perfected through obedience, and because he was willing to give up his most treasured gift, God renewed his covenant with an unbreakable oath. He swore that through Abraham's offspring, through his seed, all the nations of the earth would be blessed. Abraham's story is our story. It's a story of trusting in the unseen, of holding on to promises when circumstances scream otherwise, and of believing that God will provide, even in our most desperate moments. It teaches us that true faith is not the absence of questions, but obedience in the midst of them. Ever felt like you're running from your past, only to run straight into a new set of challenges? That's exactly where Jacob's story picks up. Fleeing the fury of his brother Esau, Jacob finds himself a stranger in a strange land, the land of Haran. He's alone, uncertain, but his journey is about to take a turn he never expected. Imagine this. You arrive in a new place, and the very first person you meet changes your life forever. At a well, a classic meeting spot in ancient tales, Jacob sees Rachel. It's love at first sight. He's so smitten that he agrees to work for her father, Laban, for 7 whole years just for the chance to marry her. 7 years. Can you imagine that kind of devotion? Jacob pours his heart and soul into his labor, the thought of Rachel making every long day feel like just a moment. The 7 years fly by, fueled by love and anticipation. The wedding day arrives. The feast is grand, the celebration is joyous. Jacob finally is about to be united with the love of his life. But in the darkness of the wedding tent, a deception unfolds. When the morning light breaks, Jacob discovers he hasn't married Rachel. He's been tricked. The woman beside him is Leah, Rachel's older sister. Can you feel the shock, the betrayal? Laban's excuse was that local custom dictated the older daughter must marry first. His heart is broken, but his love for Rachel is unshaken. Laban, seeing Jacob's determination, offers him a new deal. Work another 7 years, and he can have Rachel too. Another 7 years, 14 years of hard labor, all for the woman he loves. Jacob agrees. His struggle is immense, but his promise to himself, his promise of a life with Rachel, is stronger. He endures. And finally, Rachel becomes his wife. This part of Jacob's life wasn't just about romantic drama. It was a divine training ground. Through the deception and the extended servitude, Jacob, the trickster who once stole his brother's blessing, learns what it's like to be on the receiving end of deceit. He learns patience, perseverance, and a deeper reliance on God. His character is being forged in the fires of trial, preparing him for the great destiny that lies ahead. And what a destiny it was! Over these years, Jacob's family begins to grow, and it grows in a way that would shape history forever. Though he loved Rachel more, it was Leah who first gave him sons. First came Reuben, then Simeon, Levi, and Judah. Each birth was a mix of joy and rivalry, as Leah hoped to win her husband's love through her children. The tension in the household was palpable. Rachel, barren and desperate, watched her sister bear son after son, her heart aching with envy and a sense of failure. In her desperation, Rachel gives her handmaiden Bilhah to Jacob, and through her 2 more sons are born, Dan and Naphtali. Not to be outdone, Leah, who had stopped having children, gives her handmaiden Zilpah to Jacob, and she bears Gad and Asher. The family was becoming a complex web of wives, handmaidens, and children, all tangled in a silent competition for love, status, and legacy. It's a messy, deeply human story, isn't it? It reminds us that even the greatest figures of faith had families filled with jealousy and strife. But then, a miracle. God remembers Leah, and she conceives again, giving birth to Issachar and Zebulun, and finally a daughter named Dinah. Jacob now has 10 sons. But the desire of his heart, a child with his beloved Rachel, remained unfulfilled. The years of waiting must have been agonizing for them both. Then, at long last, God remembers Rachel. The Bible tells us he opened her womb. The joy must have been overwhelming when she finally gave birth to a son. She named him Joseph, which means God has added, a testament to her faith and a prayer for another son in the future. Joseph. Remember that name. He is a pivotal piece of this grand puzzle. With the birth of Joseph, Jacob's family is nearly complete. 12 sons in total, born from 4 different mothers. Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar, Zebulun, Joseph, and later Benjamin. These weren't just a dozen boys, they were the future. Each one was the head of a household that would grow into one of the 12 tribes of the nation of Israel. From a family marked by struggle, rivalry, and deception, God was birthing a nation of promise. Think about the dynamics. Each son carried a different story, a different relationship with their father and mothers, a different destiny. Judah, from whom kings would come, Levi, whose descendants would be the priests, and then there was Joseph. As the long-awaited son of Jacob's favorite wife, Rachel, he held a special place in his father's heart from the very beginning. This favoritism became obvious to everyone. Jacob, now an old man, doted on the boy. As a symbol of this special love, and perhaps a nod to a future leadership role, Jacob gave Joseph a gift that would become legendary, a coat of many colors. It was a stunning, expensive garment, not the kind of tunic a shepherd boy would typically wear. It was a coat that screamed, "I am special, I am chosen." While it was a gesture of deep paternal love, it was also a spark that would ignite a fire of jealousy among his brothers. They saw the coat, they saw their father's undisguised favoritism, and their resentment grew. They were the sons of the less loved wife, the sons of handmaidens, and now this boy, Joseph, was being elevated above them all. The seeds of a terrible betrayal were being sown, not by an outside enemy, but within the heart of the family itself. Jacob's journey from a fleeing fugitive to the patriarch of a nation is a powerful testament to the theme of from struggle to promise. He wrestled with his brother, with his father-in-law, and even with God himself. His life was far from perfect. It was messy, complicated, and filled with pain and mistakes. Yet through it all, God's plan was unfolding. He was taking Jacob's struggles, his flawed character, and his complicated family, and weaving them into a beautiful, epic story of redemption and destiny. The birth of these 12 sons wasn't just the expansion of a family, it was the dawn of a nation, a people chosen to carry God's promise to the entire world. And the story of Joseph, the boy with the colorful coat, is just beginning. It's the story of a nation in chains and the man chosen to set them free. This is the story of Moses and the Exodus. Centuries had rolled by since Joseph, the Hebrew vizier, had saved Egypt from famine. His memory was forgotten, and a new Pharaoh sat on the throne, one who looked upon the burgeoning Israelite population not with gratitude but with fear. Their numbers were a threat, so he enslaved them. The descendants of Jacob were forced into brutal labor, building grand cities under the crack of the whip. Their lives became a cycle of suffering and toil. Yet, a strange thing happened. The more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied. It was as if a hidden hand was protecting and strengthening them, even in their darkest hour. Pharaoh's fear morphed into a cruel decree. Every newborn Hebrew boy was to be thrown into the Nile River. It was an act of unspeakable cruelty, designed to crush the Israelites' future. But in the midst of this horror, one mother's love defied the king's command. She wove a basket of reeds, sealed it with tar, and placed her infant son within it. Tenderly, she set the tiny ark adrift among the reeds of the riverbank, her heart breaking with a mixture of terror and hope. Her daughter Miriam watched from a distance, her young eyes fixed on her baby brother's fate. By a twist of providence that could only be divinely orchestrated, Pharaoh's own daughter came to the river to bathe. She spotted the basket, and upon discovering the crying baby inside, felt a wave of compassion. She knew he was one of the Hebrew children, yet she chose to save him. She named him Moses, which means to draw out, for she had drawn him out of the water. And so the very child destined to deliver Israel from Pharaoh's grasp was raised in the heart of the enemies, court educated as an Egyptian prince, yet nurtured in his true faith by his own mother, who was cleverly brought in to be his nurse. Moses grew into a man, living a life of privilege in the palace. But he never forgot who he was. His heart ached for his people. One day he witnessed an Egyptian taskmaster brutally beating a Hebrew slave. In a flash of righteous anger, Moses struck the Egyptian down, killing him. The act, born of a desire for justice, was discovered. Fearing for his life, Moses fled Egypt, leaving behind his royal upbringing and becoming a fugitive in the vast, desolate wilderness of Midian. In the quiet solitude of the desert, Moses found a new life as a shepherd. He married and started a family. The prince of Egypt became a humble tender of flocks. It was here, in the silence and simplicity of the wilderness, that God began to shape him, stripping away the pride of the palace and forging the heart of a leader. For 40 years, Moses lived in obscurity, his past seemingly a distant dream. But God had not forgotten his people or the man he had chosen. One day, while tending his flock near Mount Horeb, the mountain of God, Moses saw a truly astonishing sight. A bush was engulfed in flames, yet it was not burning up. As he drew closer to investigate this marvel, a voice called out from the fire, "Moses, Moses!" It was the voice of God. "Do not come any closer," God commanded. "Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground." God then revealed his plan. "I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard their crying. I have come down to rescue them and to bring them into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey. So now go. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt." Moses was terrified. Who was he to confront the most powerful man on earth? He made excuse after excuse. "I am not a good speaker. They won't believe me. Pharaoh will never listen." But for every doubt, God had an answer. He gave Moses miraculous signs to perform and promised, "I will be with you." He even appointed Moses' own brother, Aaron, who was a gifted speaker, to go with him. Reluctantly but obediently, Moses took his staff, gathered his family, and set off on the long journey back to the land he had fled, his destiny now clear. Standing before the mighty Pharaoh, Moses and Aaron delivered God's message. "Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, let my people go." But Pharaoh's heart was hardened. He scoffed at their request. Who was this Lord that he should obey him? Instead of freeing the Israelites, he increased their workload, making their bondage even more unbearable. The people's hope turned to despair, and they blamed Moses. But God's plan was just beginning to unfold. It was time to show Egypt and the world his power. Thus began the 10 plagues, a series of divine judgments that descended upon Egypt with relentless force. The life-giving Nile River turned to blood. Swarms of frogs, then gnats, then flies infested the land. Livestock died from a mysterious pestilence. Painful boils afflicted the Egyptians. A devastating hailstorm of fire and ice rained from the sky, followed by a thick blanket of locusts that devoured every green thing. Then, an unnatural darkness, so profound it could be felt, covered Egypt for 3 days. With each plague, Moses repeated the demand, "Let my people go," and with each plague, Pharaoh would momentarily relent, only to harden his heart once more as soon as the affliction was lifted. The final, most devastating plague was yet to come. God instructed Moses to tell the Israelites to prepare for a special night. Each family was to take a flawless lamb, sacrifice it, and mark the doorposts of their homes with its blood. They were to roast the lamb and eat it with unleavened bread and bitter herbs, fully dressed and ready to leave at a moment's notice. This was the first Passover. That night, the angel of death swept through Egypt, and in every home not marked by the blood of the lamb, the firstborn son died, from the firstborn of Pharaoh himself to the firstborn of the lowest prisoner. A great cry of anguish rose up from all of Egypt, for there was not a house without someone dead. The mark of the blood was the sign of salvation for God's people. Shattered by this ultimate tragedy, Pharaoh finally surrendered. He summoned Moses and Aaron in the middle of the night and pleaded with them to take their people and leave Egypt immediately. And so, after 430 years of bondage, the Israelites, numbering in the hundreds of thousands, marched out of Egypt. They didn't leave empty-handed. Their Egyptian neighbors, in their haste to see them go, gave them articles of silver and gold. The slaves of Egypt were free, walking into the wilderness under God's guidance, a pillar of cloud to lead them by day, and a pillar of fire to give them light by night. Their freedom, however, was immediately tested. As soon as the Israelites were gone, Pharaoh's grief turned to rage. He regretted letting his workforce go. He mustered his elite army, his chariots, and his horsemen, and pursued them. He cornered the Israelites at the edge of the Red Sea. Trapped, with the sea before them and the Egyptian army closing in behind, the people cried out in terror. They turned on Moses, saying, "Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die?" But Moses, his faith unshaken, told the people, "Do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today." Then God commanded Moses, "Lift up your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea to divide the water, so that the Israelites can go through the sea on dry ground." Moses obeyed. All that night, a strong east wind blew, and the waters of the Red Sea parted, creating a dry path between two towering walls of water. The Israelites walked through the sea, a miraculous escape. When the Egyptian army charged in after them, God told Moses to stretch out his hand again. The walls of water collapsed, and the entire Egyptian army, chariots, horsemen, and soldiers, was swallowed by the sea. Not one of them survived. When the Israelites saw the great power the Lord had displayed, they put their trust in him and in his servant Moses. On the far shore, they sang a song of victory, a song of praise to the God who had become their salvation. The journey was far from over. Ahead lay the vast and unforgiving Sinai wilderness. But God provided for his people every step of the way. When they were thirsty, he provided water from a rock. When they were hungry, he sent down manna from heaven, a bread-like substance, and quail for meat. He was teaching them to depend on him daily. Their destination was Mount Sinai, the very mountain where God had first appeared to Moses in the burning bush. There, amidst thunder, lightning, and a thick cloud, God descended upon the mountain. From the heart of the fire and smoke, God gave his people the 10 Commandments, the moral foundation for their new life as a free nation. These laws, written by the finger of God on 2 tablets of stone, were part of a covenant, a sacred agreement. If they would obey his commands, he would be their God and they would be his treasured possession, a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. He gave them laws for worship, for justice, and for daily life, teaching the former slaves how to live in holiness and community. Though the people would often falter, grumble, and even rebel in the years to come, God's mercy and faithfulness never failed them. The slaves who cried out from Egypt had become the people of the promise. The covenant that God had made with Abraham centuries before now had a nation to carry its legacy, a people delivered by a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. The story of Moses and the Exodus is more than just an ancient tale. It's a powerful testament to the themes of liberation, faith, and redemption. It shows that no power on earth can thwart the purposes of God and that he hears the cries of the oppressed. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey. If you found this story inspiring, please give this video a thumbs up. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you won't miss our next exploration into the great stories of history and faith. We'll see you in the next video. Last time we left off with Moses, a true giant of a leader, standing on Mount Nebo, gazing at a land he would never enter. He had led his people for 40 long years, but his time was done. So who could possibly fill those shoes? Who could lead a nation of former slaves into a land filled with powerful enemies and walled cities? God had a plan. He always does. He turned to a man who had been at Moses' side, a man of quiet strength and unwavering faith. Joshua, the son of Nun. The task before him was monumental. But God's first words to him weren't battle strategies or logistical plans. They were words of pure encouragement. Imagine hearing this from God himself. Moses, my servant, is dead. Now therefore, arise, go over this Jordan, you and all this people, into the land that I am giving to them. Just as I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will not leave you or forsake you. Be strong and very courageous. What a promise. It wasn't about Joshua's ability, but God's presence. Every place his foot would touch, God had already given it to him. This wasn't a maybe, it was a done deal. All Joshua and the people had to do was walk in it. With this divine assurance, Joshua turned to the people of Israel. He reminded them of God's promise and told them to prepare themselves. In 3 days, they would cross the Jordan River. But there was a problem. A big, wet, fast-moving problem. It was harvest season, and the Jordan River was overflowing its banks, a raging, impassable torrent. From a human perspective, this was the worst possible time to attempt a crossing. It was impossible. But God often chooses the impossible to show his power. He told Joshua to have the priests, carrying the sacred Ark of the Covenant, lead the way. Think about the faith this required. The priests had to step into that raging flood, trusting that God would do something. And as soon as the soles of their feet touched the water's edge, the impossible happened. The water upstream piled up in a heap miles away. The downstream flow continued to the Dead Sea, and suddenly a wide, dry path opened up before them. The entire nation of Israel, millions of people, walked across the riverbed on dry ground, with the priests and the ark standing firm in the middle of the Jordan. It was a miracle on the scale of the Red Sea parting, a powerful message to this new generation. The same God who saved your parents from Egypt is with you today. To make sure this moment was never forgotten, God commanded them to take 12 stones from the middle of the river, 1 for each tribe, and set them up as a memorial. It was a physical reminder for their children and their children's children. When they would ask, "What do these stones mean?" their parents could tell them the incredible story of how God stopped a river in its tracks to bring his people home. Now, safely across the Jordan, their first real test stood before them. Looming in the distance was the city of Jericho. This wasn't just any city, it was one of the oldest and most fortified cities in the world. Its massive walls were legendary, seemingly impenetrable. Any military strategist would tell you this called for a long, brutal siege. You'd need catapults, siege towers, battering rams, a whole arsenal of warfare. But God's ways are not our ways. His battle plan for Jericho was, to put it mildly, bizarre. He told Joshua, "Have all your armed men march around the city once a day for 6 days. Have 7 priests carry trumpets of ram's horns in front of the ark. On the 7th day, march around the city 7 times, with the priests blowing the trumpets. Then, when you hear the long blast, have the whole army give a loud shout, and the wall of the city will collapse." Can you imagine Joshua trying to explain this plan to his generals? "So guys, here's the plan. We're going to walk. And on the last day, we're going to yell really loud." It sounds ridiculous. It defies all logic. It required absolute blind faith and obedience. For 6 days, they did exactly as God commanded. In complete silence, save for the priests' footsteps and the shuffling of a nation, they marched. Imagine the people of Jericho, peering down from their high walls. First, they were probably fearful. Then, confused. By day 5 or 6, they were probably laughing, mocking the Israelites and their strange, silent ritual. But on the 7th day, everything changed. 1 circle, 2, 3. The tension must have been electric. 4, 5, 6 times they circled the silent city. Then, the 7th time, the priests blew the final long blast on their trumpets. Joshua gave the command, and a shout unlike any other erupted from the throats of the entire nation. It was a shout of faith, a shout of victory declared before it was seen. And in that instant, the Bible says the walls of Jericho fell down flat. They didn't just crumble, they collapsed outwards, creating a ramp for the Israelite army to charge straight into the city. It was a victory won not by swords, but by shouts, not by might, but by faith. This first battle set the tone for the entire conquest. The land wouldn't be won by their power, but by God's promise and their obedience. Following the incredible victory at Jericho, Israel began the long campaign of taking the land. It was a series of battles, city by city, tribe by tribe, and through it all God was their general. He gave them strategies, he fought for them, and he delivered their enemies into their hands. Victories at places like Ai and the famous battle where the sun stood still in the sky for Joshua all pointed to one truth. When Israel obeyed God, they were unbeatable. However, every victory also came with a warning. God constantly reminded them to remain faithful to their covenant. They were to completely destroy the idolatrous practices of the people in the land and not to intermarry or adopt their ways. This was a test of their loyalty. Would they remember the God who fought for them, or would they be seduced by the culture around them? Sadly, some faltered. The story of Achan, who disobeyed God's command and took forbidden treasure from Jericho, led to a humiliating defeat at Ai. It was a harsh lesson. Sin and disobedience in the camp would break their fellowship with God and lead to failure. But when they repented and dealt with the sin, God's favor returned, and their victories continued. Finally, after years of conflict, the land was subdued. The time came to divide the inheritance. Joshua, now an old man, oversaw the distribution of the land to each of the 12 tribes, just as God had promised to Abraham centuries earlier. The journey was complete. The promise was fulfilled. With the people settled, Joshua gathered all of Israel one last time at a place called Shechem. He wasn't there to celebrate military victories. He was there to issue a final, heartfelt challenge. He recounted their entire history, from Abraham to Egypt, through the wilderness, and into the land. He reminded them of every miracle, every deliverance, every act of God's faithfulness. And then he laid down the choice, one of the most famous declarations in the entire Bible. He said, "Now fear the Lord and serve him with all faithfulness. Throw away the gods your ancestors worshipped. But if serving the Lord seems undesirable to you, then choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve. But as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord." He drew a line in the sand. You can't have it both ways. You have to choose. Inspired by his conviction, the people responded with one voice, "Far be it from us to forsake the Lord to serve other gods. It was the Lord our God himself who brought us and our parents up out of Egypt, from that land of slavery, and performed those great signs before our eyes." They renewed their covenant, swearing to follow the God of their fathers. After a long life of faithful service, Joshua died at the age of 110 and was buried in his inheritance in the Promised Land. A period of peace settled over Israel. But the story doesn't end there. The Bible notes something ominous. After that whole generation had been gathered to their ancestors, another generation grew up who knew neither the Lord nor what he had done for Israel. Joshua's generation remembered the miracles. They had seen the Jordan part and the walls of Jericho fall, but their children hadn't. The stories became just stories. Their hearts began to drift. They forgot the warnings. They began to worship the idols of the land. They did what was right in their own eyes. And the cycle of disobedience began all over again. And this ushers in the next chapter of Israel's history, the chaotic, violent, and yet merciful age of the Judges, a time of rebellion, rescue, and lessons repeated, which we'll explore in our next video. Thanks so much for watching. If this story resonated with you, hit that like button, and be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss what happens next. See you in the next one.